Spiritual intelligence is not established and developed from research alone, no matter how wide-ranging and penetrative your insights into the Western or Eastern esoteric traditions. Reading is no substitute for personal practice and everyday behavioral change. However, I can guarantee that sitting down for a few hours every day for multiple years with incredible books like this, we've got a sample of early church history, we've got Evelyn Underhill's magnum opus here, Mysticism, we've got some New Age religion, we've got some sacred sexuality, some astrology at the bottom, and one of my favourite books in my library when it comes to magical work, A Treatise on White Magic by Alice Bailey. We'll be covering this later in the series. I can guarantee that sitting down with these books is going to bring you closer to attaining spiritual powers or a sense of inner wisdom than watching more YouTube videos and scrolling on Instagram. And this is the very modern, very mundane video that I'm going to make simply to encourage you to get offline and properly honor that part of you which wants to learn more about the hidden or the occult, the mysterious, the veiled, the yet to be perceived. Let me put these books down. So how do we go about this? Well, I would argue that the best place to begin is with an anthology, particularly this anthology, The Inner West by J. Kinney. This book, interestingly, is actually the least interesting book in the 52 episodes that I am presenting to you in this series. I would argue that this book is actually relatively worthless after you've read it once. I sat down to review my notes a few days ago, and it's really not that good unless you're new to the space and you want to see about 24 different paths to go down when it comes to learning more about the great traditions of magic and witchcraft and inner wisdom and secret societies and all of that esoteric goodness. One of the traps that we fall into when we don't take time to sit down with an anthology which, broadly speaking, in this case, traces the developmental history of magical thinking and magical practice from about ancient Egypt to the modern day, going through Renaissance secret societies and looking at the turn of the magical orders and all of those secret histories which aren't a secret at all. There are so many books published about this. If we don't sit down and understand where we are in time, why we're at this place, with the internet being a wonderful and yet distracting place to hang out, we will be lost, completely adrift in a sea of spiritual and esoteric junk food in the form, unfortunately, of videos like this very video itself, which put us into passive states of receptivity rather than encouraging us to sit down with a book and a highlighter and have a mechanically engaged process which activates far more of our attention than easy to consume and easy to forget digital information which doesn't really develop our spiritual intelligence. I'm not going to go too deep or really anywhere near depth in regards to explaining the Western esoteric tradition in this video. You can go back to the start of the video, pause the video, and look at the books I held up. Every single one is worth reading. I chose them out of the library for a reason, and you could read those 10 or 11 books over the course of a few months and have a much deeper understanding, a much closer contact with that spiritual, self-actualizing, individuating impulse than any moments of going onto Instagram, looking through your spiritual friend stories and feeling that immediate spike of, oh my God, yes, this person said this thing on shamanism, this person said this thing about meditation or the chakras or some other divine masculine, divine feminine, internal knowing tantric practice that gives you a sense of spiritual identity and, unfortunately, a spiritual bypassing in that very moment where you confuse digital digitally inspired intensity with a genuine sense of learning. You know what I mean. I'm not trying to get on your case. I fall victim to this as well. There's a huge difference when it comes to honoring our spiritual intelligence when we look at information in and practices which ground us, practices which are our being, and there's, of course, the healing work and the trauma work itself. But for this video, let's just focus on the information that's coming in. If we sit down with a book, let's say we sit down with the book I mentioned earlier, it's going to be an episode in this series, Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill. I sat down with this book for a month, I think about 2 years ago. It is a truly wonderful book which covers, well, I think, when was it published? Let's have a look. It was published in 1911. First published in 1911, and this is the 14th edition, which was published in 1942. There's a different quality of energy to this book than going on Instagram and looking at a wide variety, a smorgasbord in the spiritual marketplace for hashtag mysticism. Obviously, you are not an idiot, you know the difference, and yet we fall victim to the same mistaken thinking over and over again, especially if we're looking for more close connections or spiritually minded friends or conscious friends. We start bonding. It's the idea that I explored in one of my previous videos recently, where we become spiritual refugees on the island of fantasy and spiritual bypassing, where we basically mutually reinforce each other's anti-mainstream identity and don't grow any roots because we don't really know where to look to grow the roots. You'll notice a trend over the last 10 years or so when it comes to content that you see online. Increasingly few, kind of a strange phrase, there's a decreasing number of teachers out there who will recommend books and take the attention away from themselves as opposed to bringing more attention to themselves, standing up strong, having the beautiful words and teaching as if it were their wisdom. I'm not going to name names, but some of the big gurus in the space, both Eastern and Western gurus, you'll notice as they get bigger and bigger, they speak about books less and less. Why is this? Well, to some degree, one could say maybe they've embodied the wisdom to such a degree that they no longer need to refer to books. But this is a bad example to set for anyone who's looking towards them for guidance in any way. The reason I keep wanting to try and draw your attention to a book like Mysticism by Evelyn Underhill is that I don't believe there is that much value, comparatively speaking, for you to watch hours of my videos in a single sitting or even over multiple years if we go that far together, as opposed to sitting down with 52 books in 1 year for multiple years and truly engaging with not only the information that's coming in, but taking up a pen, highlighting, writing notes, and then reviewing it later, and then speaking it. That level of clarity that comes through a deep engagement is the key to developing spiritual intelligence, at least on that mental kind of side. Of course, practice is what makes our roots grow deeper. It's about interpersonal relationships and all of the trauma healing work. But there's no substitute for just getting offline and reading a book. Most people spend an hour or 2 hours a day on social media or YouTube. The easy transition is to relinquish that time that feels very sugary and very easy and puts us into the passive, receptive, updated television couch potato mode, and shift it down to a morning or evening practice where you have at least 90 minutes of uninterrupted reading time. It will mean so much to your ongoing spiritual evolution, your individuation journey. Your focus will change, your perception will change, and this is the point that I really want to introduce now that I've gotten the rest out of the way. You'll become so much more discerning. You'll be able to go on Instagram and see someone who's posted something and go, that sounds good, and that makes me feel good, but actually, I read this book and that book. and I have this practice and that practice, and I actually know the tradition as a whole, and I can see how if I followed this advice, say for example the advice of unconditional love without conditional self-limitation, that this would lead me to a place of dissolution or fogginess, and the same in the inverse in the self-developmental space. Only conditional discipline without an unconditional self-compassion, that's going to lead us somewhere equally tragic. What basically happens as you read more and more, I've experienced this firsthand, you start to see the patterns. You start to see the many spirals which interweave to create this beautiful tapestry called human development and human history. I studied history at university. I was trained as a historian, so I already have this kind of interesting, I suppose quirky is a word I could use to describe how I view the evolution of humanity and the perception of time and generations, and not overvaluing myself too much as one individual, or even overvaluing a particular generational moment. It's very difficult, incredibly difficult, to read a book like The Inner West, an anthology which covers about 24 different esoteric traditions, and be confused or misled or ego-inflated to believe that you and I, in our generation, are the chosen ones who will do something magical to bring in the new age or the time of revelation. Because every generation believes that. And you see it time after time in the 1880s, the 1520s, and 450 BC. Human beings have that wiring in their head, and you take it much less seriously, while also, paradoxically, increasing your reverence for the short period of time that we have here to remember or learn these principles and practice them in our everyday life. I'm not going to go too strenuous on this point. I'm not going to labor the message that you should read books, because obviously you've seen some videos from me already. I clearly want you to read books and spend less time on a screen. You'll become smarter. You'll be a much better person overall. I'm not even going to put any padding around that statement. You will be a better person for reading good books every day, as opposed to consuming spiritual junk food in the form of tasty memes and attractive words which titillate your senses and gradually float you further towards the island of spiritual bypassing, where you get to dance and converse and play with all of the other fairies and wizards who do the same thing, forgetting that you're isolated and nothing's really growing, you're just getting heady. Read some more books. That's my only invitation. If you want to read a specific book, next episode of Inner Work Essentials, we're going to be looking at the most comprehensive and brilliant book about the Western Chakra system by Barbara Brennan. I kid you not, if you're only going to read one book on chakras and the auric fields, check this one out. It's all you ever need, and I don't say that lightly. I'll see you over there.